to this absolutely gorgeous, beautiful sanctuary. And a special thanks to Leslie, who very graciously opened up this building for us to take a look and to learn about its history. And I just was wondering to myself, how long has it been since there have been this many Jewish people in this building? And who knows?
1960.
1960, okay, well here we are. So at this point, I'd like to ask Alan to come up and talk about the building from a historic perspective. And then, as you know, we have some members of our own congregation, our own community, who spent time here, and I'm really pleased that they have all agreed to be a part of our event today. So first and foremost, thank you for coming, and on to Alan.
Okay. How many people, I know some, have been in the building before? Good number. Okay. Now, since 1959, when the congregation moved out to Towanda area, this building has gone through various incarnations and iterations. Much of the time, it was owned by various churches, right, who didn't have either the knowledge or the money, really, to understand the sort of historic problem that the building, or really the inclination, historic problem that the building raises. In the 1990s, a young couple, about whom there's a lot of information, whom we've met, bought the building, and they began restoring it as a house. And so far as we know, it had two owners as a house. And a lot of the work you see around you were done in that phase. And then it went through various other, it was like a hospice company or something like that for a while. And then Leslie bought it with the intention of turning it into a community center, which actually from the historian's point of view, given where this is in town, is a really appropriate use, right? Given various sort of historical preservation and historical revitalization goals that cities like Bloomington are engaged in. Now, another thing that I want to sort of say at the start is in praising this building, which is a real gem, I don't want to take away anything from the current Moses Montefiore building, which I also think is wonderful and underappreciated. It represents a different era, that is, and I know that some of you were actually here and involved with, as younger people, right, involved with the decision to move from this building to the new building in the mid to late 1950s. The McLean County Museum has a lot of documentation about that move. That was very typical. I want to say a few things about this building, but the move was very typical about what Jewish congregations were going through in the 1950s. Historians have spent a lot of time talking about, well, why is it? How did Jewish life change amid sort of the dispersal of population that we call suburbanization? Bloomington was a small city, but it experienced that also. The new building, I think of as just, really represents that time. It's a kind of modern era, also I think just a wonderful building. And so I hope that in sort of praising this building, which really represents this time, we don't underappreciate that building and the buildings around it, which I think really people should pay attention to. Right? The architects who designed the new building, as well as the architect who designed this building, were really talented people from their era who did a lot of work around here. And each of these buildings represents different phases in Jewish life, really, not only in this area, but in the United States. There's a lot that we know about this building. As far as we can tell, no architectural plans have survived. But what did survive, other than the sort of stuff that you would expect, that is from the 1870s and 80s, are newspaper clippings, a few, not an enormous number, but a few photographs, some of which are also at the current MMT. But especially, this is the most interesting document. Some of you may have seen this. The minute books of the congregation survived from the 1880s during the fundraising campaign, and then they continue for several decades afterwards. How many of you have seen those minute books? They're now currently in the McLean County Museum. There actually is an original copy and a photocopy. And if you want to learn about the origins of Jewish life in this town, it's just a great source. They're really detailed. They talk about the fundraising, the dues, the activities, the committees, and much else. Okay? A graduate student of mine, a fellow called Ryan Melson, who couldn't be here today, and wanted to introduce him, did a lot of research in drafting just an outline for a National Register of Historic Places nomination for this building, which I hope to pursue at some point once the status of the building is more secure. And he relied very heavily on those minute books, which are really extraordinary. Again, I don't know how many of your own ancestors were here at that time. The families I'm aware of came, like the Stearns. My understanding is that it came a little later, like in the early 20th century. But it really is it really is an extraordinary set of documents. Now, the building itself, again, a lot of you have been in here, is truly, from an historian's point of view, is truly valuable. Ryan reckoned that it was about the 30th oldest synagogue in the United States that still survives. It may be the most valuable synagogue building in the United States that isn't either currently in use or doesn't have some historical protection or gone through some restoration or revitalization or reuse of some sort. It really is a valuable building. It couldn't obviously be used again as a synagogue. The space is just wrong, right? Which of course is why in the 1950s they made the decision. It's one of the reasons that they had to move, right? There's not enough space for schools, the sanctuary is too small, right? All the offices are in the basement, there's no space for a library. The space just doesn't reflect, right, how people live and use buildings like this today. But it is nonetheless a valuable building. My own feeling is that if you, in terms of sort of historic designation, right, this building, right, is just fits very well the criteria that the National Register of Historic Places really lays out for historic buildings. There are 4 criteria, and to my understanding, it meets all 4 of them. Right, which is really unusual. The 4 criteria are, it has to be associated with an event or a sort of trend which is important in U.S. history and in regional history, and this building is really indicative, it's really representative of the development of Jewish life, sort of the institutional development of Jewish life in the 19th century. It also can be associated with significant people. From a historical point of view, right, the most significant family associated with this building is the Livingston family. They were the family that took, as far as the documents reveal, the most initiative in the founding of the synagogue. And also, one of the Livingston, Sigmund Livingston, the lawyer, went on to become a person of national significance because of his role in founding the Anti-Defamation League. He was sort of the person who took the initiative in the founding of it and was its first director in its early days. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, which was run out of Bloomington, Illinois, starting in the 1910s. There are also, and this is something I want to spend some time talking about, a bunch of criteria related to architecture. And this building is really architecturally interesting, and I want to talk about that in a minute. And then there's another criteria that the federal government looks for in sort of designating buildings historic, is that is a building are you likely to learn more from the building? And the fact is, I think that there's a lot to be learned from studying this building, from efforts to restore it, when a group of people with adequate resources and connections comes along to do that. A lot of people probably here know a little bit, because I know that some of you were involved in back in the 80s, there was a sort of centennial booklet that had been put out. Was anybody involved in the writing of that? Right? Just the 100-year history. It's a brief pamphlet. Was any of you involved in that back 25 years ago or so, or 30 years ago? As everyone knows, right, the congregation was founded in 1882. Okay. This building was dedicated 7 years later, which is pretty quick. It first met at the B'nai B'rith Lodge. That is the first building dedicated to Jewish life. It was not a synagogue building. That's actually not unusual at all. That's pretty typical, right? And that's really part of the story of a building like this. The congregation first met at the B'nai B'rith Hall, which had the wonderful name, given where we are, of the Abraham Lincoln Lodge. And that was founded in the early 1870s. The Jewish community itself dated back several decades, and it also had a very typical, a lot of things that sort of because people often, when locals, right, people in Bloomington normal often think, well, it's not very interesting because everything here is like normal, it's typical. In fact, from a historian's point of view, that's what makes the place really interesting, is that a lot of the stories that you find out here really are typical of the kind of thing that went on in cities like this. And the founding of the Jewish community is also really typical for medium-sized cities in the Midwest, and also some larger cities. The founders of the Jewish community here were mainly German Jews who were engaged in commerce of some sort, either retail trade, wholesale trade, whatever, right? That was, and people came over from Germany and set up commercial networks around the country, and then began to establish themselves, right, not only in large cities, but in significant transportation sort of regional centers such as this. That is really typical. Among the early families that people know about it, the Livingstons, remember, had a clothing store, right, which is in what's now known as the Front and Center building. The Livingston building, which was also designed by the architect of this, George Miller, came after the 1900 fire in downtown. The Greichheims, the Stearns' business, as far as I can tell, the business goes back to 1902, right? 1905. Okay, so it's around there. That's a little bit later, but that's also a really typical kind of business, a furniture business. And these really provided the foundation for Jewish life. That is, German Jews engaged in trade of some sort provided the foundation for Jewish life in cities like this. Now, the story is that the Livingstons themselves took the initiative in transforming this lodge into a synagogue. The story that's in the centennial history, which is confirmed by other sources, is that one of the Livingstons became very seriously ill and eventually died of this illness in the early 1880s. A fellow called Aaron Livingston. His father, whose name was Hirsch, came over to visit with his son and noticed that there wasn't a Torah there, and there wasn't sort of the basis for an active Jewish spiritual life. So he asked one of his other sons who had been in Germany to bring over a Torah, which happened in 1881, and out of that came the movement, right, to found a synagogue. Again, none of this is at all unusual. They met in a variety of places while planning this building, which they did in the course of the 1880s. The movement to build a temple, there's a lot of documentation about the fundraising and the architectural design and how they negotiated, how they planned it, right, in those minute books, began in 1883. This lot, which was then on the edge of town, right, was purchased in 1886. The building was dedicated in 1889. It cost about $15,000 at that time, which was actually a good amount of money, right, for a building of this sort, given inflation, right? They weren't skimping on the building. In the meantime, they moved around. They met in one of the congregants' shoe store, the Boston Shoe Store. They also met in the basement of what's the precursor of the current Unitarian Church, right, one of our neighbors for a time, before finally moving into here. Now, one of the things, again, that I want to really stress is that this is really typical. Again, I keep coming back to that. It's really only after the mid-1800s that Jewish communities around the country, that is after the 1850s or 60s or so, the Jewish communities around the country sort of have the kind of critical mass and initiative to begin sort of, this is a typical matter, founding synagogues. It's also, and they also began to feel confident and at home enough that they wanted the synagogue building to be a kind of showcase, right? Sort of representing them, showing them off, marking them as distinctive. It's also really typical at that time that the congregation should decide to be reformed. Especially German Jews wanted to break with sort of traditional Jewish practice. They wanted to be modern in both Germany and the United States. They wanted to be part of modern world and modern community. And they began to look upon Orthodox practices as just too old-fashioned. So this congregation, the bulk of congregations founded after the mid-19th century to the late 19th century, adopted Reform as its orientation, and it named itself very significantly after Moses Montefiore. Now, how many people know who Moses Montefiore was? Right? He was, for people who were interested in a kind of modern, sort of civically minded form of Judaism, he was, in the 1800s, a real hero. He was a British Jew who was known as the philanthropist and also a campaigner for getting rid of restrictions and prejudice against on Jews throughout Europe, and really represented that kind of Enlightenment form of Judaism, right, following the French Revolution, right, that Jews really tried to project themselves as modern. So people in this congregation will make a statement by calling the place Moses Montefiore. The Reform movement really roots go back further, but it really began to take shape after the mid-1800s. And one book that I have at home basically said that when this place was founded in the 1880s, that was really, at that time, that Judaism in the United States came most closely to being synonymous with Reform. So most of the congregations being founded at that time did adopt Reform as their grouping, as their orientation. The conservatives emerged later. They really only become important later, after about 1900, as a kind of alternative form of modern Judaism. And meanwhile, Orthodoxy, right, is only going to get a kind of revival because of the Eastern European Jews who begin to come in to the country, right, after the 1890s or so. So it was just typical, right, at that time to have a Reformed congregation. Now, the architecture was also typical, and I noticed from the centennial history that there's a bit of misunderstanding, right, that's typical, right, of why this building is as it is. There was a lot of debate among architects of religious buildings as well as among Jews as to how do you build a modern, what do you make a modern congregation look like? And the great German architectural theorist, a fellow called Gottfried Semper, who I was already interested in because he designed museum buildings. He was a theorist, another form of sort of modern educational building, which is really as a new kind of institution, art museum.